welcome and thank you so much for joining this first web series of 60-minute webinars, which will be running throughout the next couple of months on various topics within nature-based solution, which is at the heart of what we do at EcoTree. Today, the focus will be on carbon removals. And well, carbon indeed, I think, is a very hot and obviously a crucial topic, but it's also a topic that is evolving at a very high pace. And it can be very puzzling to find your way, even with the best intentions in the world. So, well, our ambition over the next 60 minutes will not to turn you into a carbon expert yet, but rather to give you, the keys and the guidelines to efficiently and safely navigate in this complex field, and also to try to give you a sort of scale of what we're talking about when we touch this very crucial topic. The way this session will be running, we'll divide it in 3 parts, roughly 15 minutes each. First, you'll hear Louisiane, our head of innovation, and she will be basically speaking about the why greenhouse gas emissions and fight against climate change is crucial, and what are the entry points when addressing this challenge. Then I'm Thomas. I'm one of EcoTree's co-founder and in charge of our international operations. I'll start to zoom into specifically the voluntary carbon market. And I'll try to elaborate on how organizations can engage in this field and be active. And last but not least, Pierre-Alexandre, our head of product and innovation, will zoom even further in and elaborate on how and why trees and sustainably managed forests can actually play a crucial role in this context. All right, and before we kick it off, just very briefly, this session is recorded. You'll get a chance to watch it on a replay, which will be communicated after the session. And if you have any question burning your lips, drop it into the chat. And we'll have a session dedicated to this. We have a team behind the scene curating the questions, and we'll be able to fuel the discussion and try to answer them at the very end of this session. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. And Louisiane, the floor is yours.
So hi everyone, I'm Louisiane, and I'll present you the topic, like the whole topic about climate change, and especially about the greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions. So to start what you need to understand, and you probably already know, is that everything is linked with our human activities. And actually, we also suffer from the consequences of climate change. So this is a bit tricky because we are the starting point of climate change, and we are the first people that suffer from it. So because of our activities, we do create emission of greenhouse gases that might be CO2, CH4, that is methane, or N2O, which is nitrogen oxide. And this is because of several activities. So globally speaking, it's mainly because of industry. You know that we are in a time where there is a lot of overconsumption, and industries are not always looking for sustainability, but they're more looking for profits. And they might create products that have planned obsolescence. So the whole industry sector is very linked with climate change, and especially with the fact that it releases a lot of greenhouse gases. The second main topic is about agriculture. So agriculture is in charge of 25% of the greenhouse gases emissions, and mainly because of deforestation, because it requires huge lands. So sometimes the farmers do burn forests, and this, of course, releases CO2 emissions. Agriculture is also linked with methane, mainly because of cows, but I won't go into the deep details. The third sector is housing. You know that we require heat, electricity, air conditioning, etc. And for the new buildings, most of these are quite energy efficient, but the old buildings do have a lot of energy leakage. And finally, transportation has an impact because we require planes and we use a lot of cars in an individual way. So all these sectors have an impact on the release of greenhouse gases that might be CO2, CH4, N2O, etc. And the issue is that we are now 8 billion people and we will be 10 billion people in 2050. So the thing is going to rise and rise if we don't stop, if we don't reduce our greenhouse gases and our way of consuming the industry, the transport, the agriculture, and the housing. So let's try to engage you by asking you, is the greenhouse effect a good or a bad thing for life on Earth? Actually, it's a tricky question. So we invite you to scan and use your phone. So you can scan the QR code on the top left and say that if you think that the greenhouse effect is a good or a bad thing for life on Earth. Okay, so it's moving a bit. So maybe if we go on this next slide for the answer, when you think, Thomas. Actually, the greenhouse effect is a good thing. We couldn't live the way we live without the greenhouse effect. The temperature on Earth would be about minus 15 degrees. And you know that on average now it's more plus 15 degrees. So there's a 30 degrees difference. And why is that? Is that because normally there are some greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It has a positive impact. Let me explain. So there are some solar radiation going from sun to the Earth. And then the solar radiations are re-emitted, reflected from Earth to the atmosphere. But because of the greenhouse gases, some of it is stopped and remains in the atmosphere. And this is why now it's plus 15 degrees in the atmosphere. However, on Earth, However, if we have more and more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then we will have less solar radiation coming back from Earth to space. So the temperature on Earth is going to increase and increase. This is said very simply, and it's not 100% scientifically correct. However, it's so that everyone understands the greenhouse effect and why greenhouse gases are actually a problem if it creates additional greenhouse effects. However, normally it's a good thing. So I've been speaking about the greenhouse effect in a global way and quite broad way, but let's focus on CO2, which is one of the greenhouse gases. And it's the one that is the most powerful and the most present within the atmosphere. But all the greenhouse gases have different properties. And so let's focus on CO2. It's been increasing and the concentration of CO2 has been increasing, and we measure it with the ppm unit, which is parts per million. And we now reached 420 ppm, which is the concentration of CO2 within the atmosphere. So if we go on the next slide, you need to understand the carbon cycle. So I was saying that there is CO2 in the atmosphere and the concentration is rising. So it's represented in the orange box. So there is carbon in the atmosphere. And where does this carbon goes? Actually, a lot of it goes in the ocean, and a lot of it also goes in the biosphere, and the rest remains in the atmosphere. So more or less, there is half of the carbon that remains in the atmosphere, a quarter that goes in the ocean, and a quarter that goes in biosphere, which is forests and soils. So the ocean and the biosphere, and especially forests, are the two main carbon sinks on Earth. So it enables the fact that through photosynthesis or through dissolution, it absorbs the carbon, which is great for us because it helps us to tackle climate change. And then the carbon is going to go from these carbon sinks to the lithosphere, so the very deep soils. And then because we use fossil fuels, we will use it again, and it will create fossil fuels that we are going to burn the fossil fuels, and this has an impact because it releases CO2 emissions, so the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. And this is the way the carbon cycle works. So there is also the fact that deforestation has an impact on CO2, because of course, if we burn trees, so if we burn the biosphere, it's gonna release CO2 emissions. So this is the whole carbon cycle. Now that you understood the greenhouse gases, the greenhouse effect, especially the carbon cycle and the CO2 concentration that is arising, how can we act? So internationally speaking, we've been signing the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015 and then approved in 2016. And it says that the temperature increase should be limited from plus 1.5 to plus 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial time, which is 1870. And so for this goal, to stay between plus 1.5 and plus 2 degrees, of course, we need to reduce our CO2 and other greenhouse gases emissions. So what the Europe says is that we should limit it, we should decrease our greenhouse gases emission by at least 55% by 2030. And we should try to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So these are the international agreements on how we should reduce our impact. And of course, companies are engaged to do their part as well, but we'll speak about this later. And then another very important thing is that because it helps us to tackle climate change, of course, we need to conserve our capacity to sequester carbon. And so we need to halt deforestation, land artificialization, ecosystem damages, etc. And through this, you start understanding why climate and biodiversity are highly linked, because climate change has a negative impact on biodiversity, and biodiversity has a positive impact. I mean, trees, ocean, etc., have a positive impact on climate change because it helps us to tackle climate change through the fact that it's carbon sinks. So now, how can you act? So CSR, corporate social responsibility, is a great way to create a sustainable company. I like this graph because it represents the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And it shows that the economy relies on the society, so on the fact that your employees are well educated, are in good shape, that there is less poverty, etc. And all of this also relies on the biosphere. So on biodiversity, that might be terrestrial or the ocean, and also on climate change. So CSR is a global strategy to make your company more sustainable. However, this webinar is going really to focus on your climate strategy. So how can you create a carbon strategy? The first thing is to calculate your carbon footprint. So what is it? It's a way of trying to measure your greenhouse gases emissions. So not only CO2, but also all the other greenhouse gases. However, we use a common unit to compare all these greenhouse gases, and it's the CO2 equivalent. And so we measure the carbon footprint in tons of CO2 equivalent that are emitted by a company per year. And we look at the greenhouse gases emission in 3 scopes. The first one is the direct emissions. So you're going to look at what are the emissions that are released on site, on your site. So it might be fuel that you burn, it might be your own vehicles. The second scope is indirect emissions, and especially most of the time it's through electricity, because you're going to use the electricity on site, but most of the time it's not produced and it does not release emissions on your site. And the third scope is all the rest. So your suppliers, the emissions that are created by your suppliers, and the transport of your employees when they come from home to your office, and also the impact, the end of life of your product or service that you create. And most of the time, 80% of a carbon footprint is on the third scope. So then, once you understood and measured your carbon footprint, you need to define your carbon strategy. And I'll go very brief on this slide, but basically you need to avoid the greenhouse gases that you might release for like the one you could avoid. And then the one you cannot avoid, you need to minimize it. And then the rest of it, the ones you cannot avoid, you cannot minimize, you should offset it. So on the next slide, I really advise you to use the SBTi framework. So the SBTi is the Science-Based Target Initiative, and basically it helps the company to set targets that are scientific and that are okay, that are compliant with the Paris Agreement. So what does it say? It says that first you need to set up a short-term target, which is 43% reduction most of the time by 2030. Then you need to set a long-term target, which is 90% reduction by 2050. And because we want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, actually there is 10% of your emission that remain in 2050. So you need to buy carbon credits that do sequester carbon and that are high quality. And then if you want to go further, what the SBTi says is that you can contribute to more carbon credits that are going to have a positive impact on carbon sequestration. And this is because we know, of course, that there will be a lot of companies that won't achieve these goals. So we need to help carbon sinks to sequester and sequester. So we need to finance the carbon sinks more than only 10% of your emissions. So you see that we, EcoTree, have activities that are linked with the third and the fourth steps. So this is the SBTi framework, and I really invite you to have a look to it. And it's an international framework that was created by the United Nations, the CDP, the WWF, etc. I hope that you understood more or less the context, and I'm going to let Thomas keep on with the carbon market and the voluntary carbon market, especially.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luciane. Happy to take over from here. Indeed, I'll try to introduce you into more specifically into the voluntary carbon market. Before I get going, let me just also give you a sense of scale, as I said in my introduction, but this time in terms of timing. I think you may be familiar with this curve. It shows basically the effect of waiting, and the more we wait into addressing, avoiding and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the more steep the curve will be, and which means basically the bigger the effort that we're going to have to do will be. So this, the more we wait, the worse it becomes. And right now it means basically we have a sort of a 5% as a reduction as a target, as a yearly target, just to give you a sense of scale. As this is more or less, it's commonly accepted that during the COVID period, the emissions due to the lockdowns and all that has reduced by 5%. And well, we've all seen the differences in our lives and in our behavior. But this is actually what would be kind of needed in that scale if you want to reach the targets, because we've been waiting so long before actually changing our behavior. So yeah, without sounding too dramatic, I think this is an important reminder that time is of the essence here. Just to again give you a clear picture, there are actually, especially in Europe, two main markets that the organizations can be involved when it comes to carbon sequestration and carbon credits. You have the regulatory market, which obviously is a regulated market, and I would ignore it for today. That could feel another webinar in itself. These are for certain specific companies that have mandatory obligations into compensating their footprint. What you are likely to be interested in, what we will be talking today, is the voluntary market, which, as it says, is basically open to organizations and companies and businesses among them that are willing to do and free to do whatever they believe is relevant. Again, let me give you a few sense of a scale of what we're talking about when we talk about the voluntary carbon market. Here you see the financial volumes behind this market. It covers the period from 2005 to last year, as of 2021, sorry. There is no accurate data yet for 2022 because, well, it's a tremendous work to gather all that. I could have asked ChatGPT to give me the figures, but it doesn't take into account 2022 yet. But what you can see here clearly is that obviously there's a growing trend. It has exceeded far the $1 billion per year in 2021 for cumulative value invested income in this voluntary carbon market of above $8 billion. So it is obviously becoming a very massive market. When it comes to the volume that are traded, how many tons of carbon are we talking about? Here again, you get a sense of the scale we're talking about. You still see this growing trend. What's interesting is that there's been a slight decline in 2022, at least in terms of volume from the preliminary data that is available. But what it shows is those peaks. It's difficult, to be honest, to see any relevant pattern in these peaks at this stage. There are obviously many factors involved, but still this volatility shows that we're talking about a very active market, which I guess ultimately is a good thing, but to be followed. And last but not least, you're also probably very familiar with this trend, but the pricing of carbon credits on those markets are clearly, going upward. This is an estimation from Ernst & Young, and they all go more or less into the same upward direction. What's fueling this upward trend is clearly, on the one hand, well, the increasing demand. In a way, the lack of the challenges on scaling the supply of carbon credits, and also the increasing expectations in terms of quality. So the combination of those three factors are clearly pulling the price up, which in a way is an incentive, like it or not, for acting now and not postponing too much your decisions in acting on those markets. And well, as we'll see, it's a very wide and various market. And within the term carbon credits, there is a lot of things, which obviously is one of the reasons why it is so puzzling sometimes to navigate into it. Here gives you an idea of the multiplicity of credits that you could find. They are still in primary sectors. What this doesn't show, but is that most of the credits issued today are based on or are located in Asia, in South America, and in Africa. We are one of the European players, and the European-based carbon credits are increasing, but it's certainly not the majority yet. And you see that most of the demand is actually coming from mining, energy sector, and also consumer goods. And it is expected, it is fairly commonly accepted that the whole digital world, as well as the housing, the construction, will quite certainly fuel a big part of the demand over the next couple of years. This is quite a crucial difference you absolutely need to be aware of when you enter any possible action in voluntary carbon markets. It's a difference between the so-called carbon offsets and carbon removals. The first ones, as it's shown on this graph, are basically based on avoided emissions, avoided or reduced emissions. And so if as an organization, you emit 1 ton, you can indeed purchase and sort of balance in a way the emitted ton that's on your account. But well, your ton will still be out there in the atmosphere. You will not have technically removed it. So it's not saying this is a bad thing, but it is necessary, but possibly not sufficient, which is why you have what the so-called carbon removals, where indeed there is a capture of CO2, which is actually removed from the atmosphere, and which gives the opportunity to talk about the quite commonly heard net zero, which, by the way, since I've mentioned this, I'd be very keen in hearing if you are familiar with the difference or not between the concept net zero and carbon neutrality, as you may have, or you may be hearing both on a very frequent basis. So here again, feel free to scan the QR code on the screen and try to find out whether those two concepts are identical, different, or complementary. And it's all right to be lost. Absolutely. I'll give you a couple of seconds to try to answer. Well, it's obviously a good thing that you've joined this webinar. We try to answer this question. Let me go ahead. Well, there are two different things. The net zero means that you are ultimately reducing your emissions, ideally based on scientific targets or scientifically based frameworks like the SBTI that has been introduced previously. So you are engaged in an avoidance and reduction journey. And on the incompressible part, you are then contribute through carbon removals, right? Carbon sequestration credits. And this is what indeed the science-based target, and as well EcoTree, by the way, is encouraging. On the other side, carbon neutrality is somehow a little bit lighter. It's a lighter commitment because technically it means you could be business as usual. You have a certain amount of emissions and you purchase or acquire credits, which can be carbon sinks, carbon capture, but also carbon avoidance in order to sort of balance your emissions. But this means that you could even technically be on an ISO level of emissions, or you could even increase your emissions if, for example, your business is growing, so your emissions are increasing, and you can still claim carbon neutrality as long as, again, you balance them off on a mathematical point of view. So obviously, carbon neutrality is not a bad thing, it's a good start, but again, it's more challenging, it's more demanding, and it's obviously more needed to engage in net zero, which is a stronger claim and a more challenging claim to do. I hope this has clarified both, and again, happy to elaborate further in the Q&A session. If I continue zooming in, so we're in the voluntary market. We're now talking about the carbon removals, not the carbon offsets. And within the carbon removal, there are typically two categories, the nature-based one and the technology-based one. Here again, both are needed. But there's an important difference for you to understand if you want to engage in this market. Nature-based, well, it says what it says, and you have a few examples here. It's it's all the one where basically we leverage the power of and the technology still of Mother Nature. On the other hand, the technology-based are the ones the technology that we develop. You can see at the bottom of the scale the pros and cons of each. Obviously, we are into the nature-based, and we believe that those are definitely the ones that can bring us forward. As Louisiane said in her introduction, oceans and forests are the two main carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks on Earth. So it's a good start to leverage them, but that shall not, provide us forbid us to develop technologies like direct air capture and so forth. So I guess there's no miracle solution, that's for sure. And obviously, we're going to need to combine all the nature and technology-based solution if you want to move forward successfully. Well, with all this, this various typology that I have exposed so far, obviously, you end up with having many players on the field. Here's a quite a simple, there are way more complex mappings. What's important for you to understand, and that's the point, is like whenever you engage in these markets, it's important to understand which organization you're dealing with. What is their core role? Are they playing on different roles? What are the links with the other players? All those type of due diligence is quite vital before engaging. We at EcoTree, for example, are a project developer. We also sell credits, and then we sometimes deal with platforms, and obviously we also have our own standards. So it's important to do this mapping whenever you engage to understand who and which type of player you're talking to. I guess you're familiar with those 5 criteria because they are obviously common sense in a way, but let me just briefly describe them. And those are really the 4 criteria that should be checked before you engage on carbon capture projects. Measurability, obviously, and this, I say this regardless of the certification that you're getting through the project that you invest in, because even the most internationally recognized label, and there's been some press coverage about that, they're not necessarily, or that doesn't prevent you from doing a due diligence on whether those 4 criteria are properly answered. Measurability. This is basically the commonly accepted idea that it has to be transparent. You need to be able to trace, to verify, to measure the impact of what's actually happening with those carbon credits. Unicity, well, that's an important one. Obviously, it means that a credit can only be used once and by a single entity. The obvious reason here is to avoid double accounting, which would be sort of cheating and wouldn't fix the problem. Additionality, this actually has 2 factors, 2 concepts. You have the ecological or natural additionality on the one hand, where you need to prove and you need to check that the project you invest in or the credits that you're buying is actually having a net positive impact versus what's called a baseline scenario, which is basically if the project wouldn't occur. So in a forestry project, it means like what is the sequestration that will occur on a forestry project versus if the forestry project was not implemented. Pierre-Alexandre will get back to that in the last phase of the presentation. So that's the ecological natural additionality. Then you have the economical additionality, which is a bit more ignored or underestimated, which means that you need to secure and guarantee in a way that the project wouldn't have happened without the valuation of the carbon credit. Right, so in a way that your engagement as a buyer of carbon credits is what has economically triggered the project. That's how you can claim true natural and economic additionality with your project. And last but not least, permanence. Well, what is really permanent in this world? But at least it's important to secure that the carbon credit, the sequestration, the capture that has occurred is not, is as permanent as possible, and that carbon is not going to be released one way or the other back into the atmosphere. Right, and importantly again is that whatever label you are, putting on as a front line on your credits and rely on, it is important that you do the proper due diligence on those 4 criteria and understand how you check all those boxes, and that you communicate appropriately about it. Most of the greenwashing accusation don't always come from poor project. Of course, there are some, but often it becomes because there's been a miscommunication in one of those or several of those criteria. So it's quite important to have a proportionate communication after having done a proper due diligence on those 4 criteria. And because that was in the detail, I just finished with this example and then I'll hand over to Pierre-Alexandre. But typically even a sort of afforestation, so forestry-based carbon removal project can actually imply very different things. On a tree plantation on one hand, or a more sustainable forestry on the other hand, both would be a very legit afforestation carbon credits. But as you can see here, obviously, in terms of actual long-term ecosystemic impact, we are not necessarily talking about the same thing. But I'll let Pierre-Alexandre elaborate on this part and the final section of this webinar before then we hit on the Q&A section. Thank you. Floor is yours, Pierre-Alexandre.
Thanks, Thomas, for this. Very interesting, like to see the background of the carbon market, carbon credit markets. Now I'm going to focus on the forest and how and why they can be considered as a carbon sink. So first of all, why is a carbon sink? It's just simple math. It's just something that it captures more carbon than it actually emits. So does the forest actually absorb carbon? Yes, of course. We all know that, you know, trees actually capture some carbon. We'll see this into more details in a few slides. But they also do release carbon. Why is that? Because, I mean, the trees, they actually breathe like us. So they do capture some carbon, but they actually also emit some carbon. But, you know, if you just sum these two effects together, ultimately there is some sort of balance, and eventually it might reach a level where it's very stable, so it emits as much as it actually captures. But as it grows, it will actually capture more carbon than it actually emits. So this is how and why we're able to generate some carbon credits, removable carbon credits from forestry projects. But first of all, just maybe before we go into more details, what is the unit that is used for carbon credits? I'll be curious to know what you guys actually think. So we'll wait for a few answers. All right, okay, so I've got some answers starting to appear. Because basically we talk, you know, about carbon credits or CO2 emissions or a ton of CO2 equivalent and so on. So it's sometimes a bit of a mess. As Louisiane mentioned a bit earlier, the main issue are greenhouse gases, which are CO2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas because of its structure. Basically, I don't know if you remember the image from the molecule of CO2. Carbon in itself is not an issue, is not a problem. It's actually crucial to life on Earth, and in itself it does not actually contribute to global warming. But CO2, because of its structure, will you know, restitute some heat from the sunlight and actually contribute to global warming. So this is what we need to remove from the atmosphere. But do trees actually keep CO2 within themselves? Well, actually, not really. It's a bit more complicated than that. So let's go back to the basics on how trees actually grow. So here you can see some formula. We're not going to go too much into details, but basically, what does a tree need to grow? It needs CO2 from the atmosphere, water, and light. Basically, the light is the energy, and the water is contributing to, thanks to photosynthesis, to converting CO2 into both sugar and glucose. You've got the formula here, which actually capture carbon, but carbon as an atom, not CO2, and actually re-releases O2 into the atmosphere. So this is actually how trees will capture CO2. You've got at the top of the slide just the name of some guys who actually found how it was working, and it's quite interesting because basically what they did, they made a tree grow in a pot, measuring the quantity and the weight of the soil, and they noticed that as the trees actually kept going, well, the volume and the weight of the soil was not changing too much. So they concluded that they were actually getting something from the air, from the atmosphere. And so this is basically how trees capture carbon. So they actually play a major role into the carbon sequestration, because again, I mean, you can see this is the second biggest carbon sink in the world after the ocean. And so it is crucial to maintain some healthy forests, so just to actually play the role of a carbon sink. But now, how do we measure the carbon? We'll see on the next slide that we need to make sure that we can quantify how much carbon is actually captured through our project, our forestry project. As Thomas mentioned just a few minutes ago, measurability is of course key. So we need to know how much carbon is within the trees. The trees do have some carbon in wood. There is some carbon, but again, not CO2. And then, so what we need to do actually on the site to measure how much CO2 equivalent was captured by the trees is to actually go there and measure the trees. So how wide are they? How tall are they? And then we've got a pretty good idea of the volume of wood. Then from this volume, we just convert it into like the dry matter from the wood. We deduct how much carbon is within it, and then we convert it into CO2 equivalent. So, I mean, it's very straightforward just to know how much carbon, how much CO2 was actually captured by the trees. We just need to simply. In practice, it's a lot of work, but you just need to go and measure your tree, and then you're able to see how much carbon was actually captured by the trees. Then we need to just differentiate different ways forests can actually capture and kind of retain carbon or avoid emissions. So we talk about the 3 S's. So the first one is sequestration. Basically, sequestration means that the trees actually keep carbon within themselves as they are living in the forest, right? Storage is a bit different. Is once the tree is actually harvested, it will be used as wood, as a material, and this material, even though it's not living anymore, will keep on actually storing some carbon like within the material. So for instance, if you use wood to build your house or something, then the carbon will stay there for a very long time. So depending on the use of the wood, it will actually also influence how much carbon credits are actually emitted through this project. We'll see that in a minute. Finally, substitution is basically when you decide to use, again, wood, for instance, to build your house instead of concrete, the impact that it has on the atmosphere, like the related embedded emissions, is going to be much lower. In our methodology, we estimate it, but we don't use it for carbon credits. It's not included in our quantification for a simple reason. It's just that it just relies on so many assumptions that we consider that we cannot like confidently tell something that is precise enough. Although for sequestration and storage, we know pretty well what's going on. So you'll see on the graph that will just show you. Here you can see basically, we'll start with the graph on the left. And what you can see, there are quite a few graphs. The darker line is going to be the total the carbon that is sequestered plus the carbon that is actually stored within the material that actually goes out from the forest. So you can see the lighter green is parallel, but a bit below is going to be just the sequestration, and you just sum it up to the green area at the bottom of the graph. That will be the estimation for the storage of the carbon. So if you just sum them up, you can see that at some point, so you're looking at the darkest line, at some point it kind of stabilizes, it actually reaches a steady state. And this is actually the potential of the forest for permanent carbon capture. So this is how many carbon credits can be associated to a forestry project. So I'll go just very briefly back to the concept that Thomas actually just mentioned. So I think it's next slide. So uniqueness is not something for the forester. It's just the project developer that need to make sure that they only sell the carbon to only one person, so that only one entity can claim this carbon credit. So you need to really make sure when you buy some carbon credits that there is a registry associated to it, and that it has a unique ID and it was only sold to you. Additionality, we covered the topic. Again, it's based on the baseline scenario. Permanence is what we just mentioned. So we could see that on the forest level, we can reach permanence by ensuring that there are always trees staying on the site. Also, going back to what Thomas just mentioned, the key difference between sustainable forestry management and like traditional forestry management with shorter cycle where you harvest all the trees after every like 30-40 years, is that you can ensure that the ecosystem is much more resilient while leaving a continuous coverage. So that's why we actually think it's really important to never do this full harvest all the time. And then measurability, we actually mentioned it just before. We just measure the trees. So there are going to be just a few graphs. I mean, we already kind of talked about it. Just to give you an idea, it's just that for a different, actually, if you can go back to slide 41, Thomas. This is how we build a forestry project. You can see 4 different species of trees, because we like to mix species together, and that we sum them up to get the next slide, the next graph, and then we know how many carbon credits we have. But then there might be some caveats with that, because as soon as you look at numbers, you have a model, and you just kind of do the math. One could be tempted to actually optimize the carbon sequestration. I mean, it's just an equation, and you can optimize it by playing with the factors. But this is kind of dangerous, and that would be a very great mistake, because if we were to optimize the carbon capture, we would actually lose the resilience. We would choose only the best species of tree to capture a maximum of CO2 for the short term. But we need to think a bit longer term, knowing that it needs to be. There are many things that we do not understand, and that we need to be very humble about the natural processes and what's going on in the ecosystem. So again, we try to make sure that the ecosystem is resilient and can last for a very long time. And then another one is that thinking just about carbon would also be a terrible mistake, because of course forests are a great carbon sink. It's one of the biggest in the world, as we mentioned, but it's not their only role. I mean, they also play a crucial role for biodiversity, or also for the social aspect. I mean, when you go in hiking in the forest or camping or whatever, I mean, it plays a role. I mean, some of the roles are not quantified within carbon projects. So again, you need to see the forest as a complex ecosystem that actually plays so many roles and not only carbon. So it's a great tool, but again, you need to make sure that a project is not just carbon. And this is an issue with the technology-based solutions. We, of course, probably going to need them, but they only play the role of capturing carbon, but we are lacking all the rest. So I think we are running short. I mean, we are a bit late, so I'll just stop here. And if you have some questions, you can add them and post them in the chat, and we'll try to address some.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. We do have already a few I can see here, so I'll start. I'll take the first one, which goes from Hannes asking which carbon removal solution, nature-based versus technology-based, has the highest impact on the short term. Maybe I can take that one, and it is it's a difficult question, difficult answer at least, because I think it's wrong in a way to look at only short term. So indeed, as we just mentioned, direct air capture has probably a very immediate short-term impact, but it lacks other environmental impact, as Pierre highlighted, and it's also very pricey. So it's 5 to 10 times more than nature-based, some of the nature-based credits. So is it a solution to, can it be scaled sufficiently? Or similarly, if you look at, again, forestry, Short term, you would go into monocultural tree plantation, but that would lack the permanence, because that carbon will be cut and then released. So the trees will be cut and released, releasing the carbon. There would be very little biodiversity benefits. So it is very difficult to look at it just from a short-term point of view. And at least we believe that it's important to have a holistic approach, like what is the overall environmental impact, and definitely to take into consideration that there is no quick fix, and whether it's technology or nature, we need to look at it on a long-term perspective. That would be my answer. Maybe a question for you, PA. Astrid is asking, how does the voluntary carbon credit prices compare to the legislated credits? So basically the regulated market.
Well, it's a bit hard to say. I would say right now it really depends on the project. So what you need to understand is that the legislated and regulated credits are actually quotas, meaning that some industry decide that they can emit that much carbon, and then they share it, and the one that actually emit more need to pay money to the one emitting less, so that they all keep up with this level. And this is very well tracked. I mean, there are some futures. I don't have to keep the ticker in mind, but you can actually check it on the web, and you get the graph with like the market price for different futures, different maturities. And, you can see it's around like 100 euros, something like that. It really varies, but you can see it. The difficulty that the voluntary carbon market, as it is voluntary, first of all, there are many methodologies, so the cost might change actually drastically depending on the type of project that you do. Is it technological? Is it nature-based? Is it avoided emission? Or is it nature-based? Or is it captured, sorry. And also it's over the counter. So there is no index. I mean, there are more and more index trying to get an idea of the price, but it's a bit harder to track because everyone kind of every project has its own specificities and a different price. If I answered the question. I believe this one is for you, Louisiane.
Sorry. Okay, so how can companies get started with the SBTi? So basically you go on the website of the SBTi, there is a huge report that explains how to set scientific targets. And then you set your targets, you send it to the SBTi, and you send also your strategy to achieve these targets, and they are going to rate it, and then you need to pay if they accept it, and you can say that your standards, like your targets, are scientifically based.
Right. Then
yeah, maybe an interesting one is which certification standard do we use? We've mentioned some of them, and some of them are very well known. You mentioned that we have developed our own. Maybe you can clarify what that means, Pierre.
Yeah, so basically, again, depending on the actually, I'll try and address several questions at the same time, because I'm asked about the double accountability as well. How do we address that? So again, we stick to standards. We decided to develop our own methodology, which is verified by Bureau Veritas, because it is the most adapted to the way we manage forest, and it is the most accurate to how much carbon we actually capture with our forest. It is based on the same logic and on the long-term average concept, which is based on Vera and used also in the French label bas carbone. So this is what we use most of the time, but we are also able to use some other standards and to really adapt to the different markets. And just for instance, like this label bas carbone in France or woodland carbon code, I mean, we can do this as well. Then the double accountability is a bit of an issue, because if you talk about the double accounting of the same ton, well, then we keep a registry and we know exactly which ton was sold to who. And I mean, there is no issue there. We know exactly who owns what, and we don't sell them twice. If the question is more about like the regulation, like is it accounted for the country's contribution or to the enterprise contribution, there it really depends on the market. In some countries like France, for instance, or Denmark, and it's not an issue because they consider that it's two different accounts. But some other countries like Germany is a bit more tricky. It's not so clear. So I mean, again, it's a work in progress. We are trying to really adapt to every specificities of the countries. I feel I can also talk about the next one, which is quite interesting. Like basically, how much emission does a tree actually capture? And do you reckon planting more would solve the issue? Well, on a given surface, if you plant more trees, eventually, I mean, all the trees will grow together. They will like be very big and like very tight, close to each other. And if a big one falls, actually, after a while, it will actually reach a steady state. And so as we can only value the permanent carbon, you cannot plant just more trees on one area, because eventually it will reach its full potential that is permanent. So, I mean, that would be pointless. Again, it needs to be very long lasting, because if you plant a lot of trees and also just planting more trees on more surface and so on, but without maintaining the forest after that, I mean, it doesn't really make sense. It's more about like not only planting trees, but making sure that the forest actually thrives and stays on for a very long term. I don't know about the next one. What the current price per ton for a nature-based solution project? Again, it really depends. Also, just a simple example, it might depend on the baseline scenario. So you can have like two identical projects, let's say two forests, one on agricultural lands and one on damaged forest. Let's say you have exactly the same cost, exactly the same trees planted, exactly the same everything. Based on the baseline scenario, you will have much more tons on the agricultural land than on the damaged forest. So for the same cost, you divide it by less or more units. So the price actually might vary very drastically. So it can really evolve depending on the specificities on the project.
An interesting one maybe is, how do we select a project at EcoTree? Maybe as an introduction, what I can say here, and you're happy to have you elaborating on this, Pierre-Alexandre, is again, we try not to solely focus on the optimizing the carbon sequestration, but we put at an equally important level the restoration or preservation of biodiversity, because we aim, it's not just about planting trees, it's about having them thrive and developing into healthy and long-lasting ecosystems, right, that have a long-term positive impact. So that's, I would say that our compass is not just optimizing the carbon, is equally important to care about the biodiversity impact, or even the social impact of the way we implement those projects. We also try to favor positive impact in terms of the local economy or the local communities. We also try to take care, of course, obviously, of what makes, I mean, we'd never copy paste a project, basically. Every project designed and implemented by our own team, this is also important to mention, is unique in a way and tries to adapt, cope with the local situation, and not just the current situation, but also what we estimate are likely to be the situation, the conditions in the future. Because those, as we said, those projects aim for permanent forest coverage. So we need to make sure that on top of the natural resilience of trees and forest ecosystem, they will be thriving not just today or the next 10 years, but for the next couple of 100 years to come. So this is also something we try to take into consideration.
And maybe just to add something, we have some clients that choose projects according to where their company is implemented and or where their suppliers are implemented. And so they consider the geographic approach when they choose a project. So it might be also something to consider, but of course the co-benefits of a project, what is the impact on the biodiversity and on social and societal, etc., has to be considered as well, according to what is your CSR strategy.
Well, thank you very much. I think time is out. So thank you very much for again joining and for your time staying with us during this webinar. We hope you feel a bit more enlightened on what and how to start when it comes to carbon removals or nature-based solution. Feel free to reach out, of course, to any of us, and again to stay in touch and hopefully get active on your sustainability journey. Thank you very much. And well, I hope to see you soon. And as I used to say, may the forest be with you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.